very welcome with us here in Santiago de Chile, you over there in Aberdeen, winter and summer united. Um, and the idea we had was to talk with you, to have a conversation about, in general, two inspirations that are very interwoven. On the first place, I will show it manually. Why not? We will have this the presentation after a couple of years of the translation of Anthropology and as Education, which has this beautiful artwork by Manuela Raceto, a
Okay.
burning piece of paper. And the translation is Llevando la vida, Antropología y Educación on the one hand. And on the other hand, well, I mentioned an article in How, the How journal now, Uywasiña and Aymara Cosmopraxis, which is, as a matter of fact, a research, a study project that we have been carrying on for the last 5 years, and which would be rather the second part of our conversation. Is that if that is okay with you? So we could start with the first, what I called inspiration, the educational, anthropological, and ethical dimension of what you have been doing, not only recently. I understand it's a long, your already long career. So concerning this book, concerning anthropology and as education, in this attentive translation, Llevando la vida, leaving, pardon, not leaving, leading a life. No, you start the book mentioning that education, I quote, is really about attending to things and attending to the world. No? And you install this dialogue, this initial dialogue with John Dewey's work, the pragmatist philosopher, educational theorist also, and the author of Democracy and Education, an interesting title. You're also inspired by these Belgian pedagogues you mentioned, Maskelyne and Simons, when they analyze these moments, magic moments you call them, that sometimes occur during educational processes, and where presencing and attending intimately intertwine. The same, we could say, about the experience of how we engage anthropologically with a certain group of people and accompany them attentively along the flow of their meshwork of life. So, um, attending to life, attending to things, to the world, attention in your work, I would dare to say, is part of, well, not only what I call, or what we call a quartet, four important concepts, but in education, anthropology and as education, you mention at least three in combination with correspondence. These three, it's the triad, habit, agencement, and attentionality, that would be replacing volition, intentionality, and agency.
Right.
So, and these three are brought in a very close relation with the correspondence, the practice of corresponding. So this would be a first invitation for you, if you would like to offer maybe a more general reflection about what is the anthropological outline, the conceptual outline of the book in more general terms. And then we can um, have some other approaches more about certain themes in
Okay.
other interventions, if it's okay for you.
I suppose it's part of adopting a process philosophy, a philosophy of becoming, or a philosophy of being. One of the things that I was most taken by was the idea of the middle voice. I can't remember whether I develop it in that book or not, but the middle voice of the verb, which is common in many non-European languages, and you also find it in ancient Greek, but not in modern Indo-European languages, is a voice in which you are inside what you do, so that what is done is achieved in you. If I run, I'm inside my running. If I walk, I'm inside my walking. So it's my walking that walks me and my running that runs me. So that the action itself, the movement, the process comes first. And then whatever falls out of that comes later, including what we might call objects and subjects. So our own, let's call Western, if I want a better word, our own Western thinking is grammatically framed within this subject verb object structure, so that the verb is something that comes in between as a subject who's an intentional agent who's setting out to do something, and a result, an objective, what is done on the other side. So there's what you do on the one hand, and what is done to things on the other. And the beautiful thing about the middle voice of the verb is that it turns that inside out, so that the subject and object, if you can talk about them at all, are inside the verb itself. We know there are a lot of Amerindian languages that have this so-called ergative structure, but it's not limited to them. It's quite common to languages around the world. And so I'm trying to think in those terms. What would happen if we really started with the process, with the action as something that is formative in its own right? So that, for example, is the distinction between volition and habit. With volition, you would have the idea that there's a person, an individual, an agent with free will and with an intention, and he or she wants to do something, and then they do it, so that the subject is out there in front of the action and can be defined quite independently of it. But with habit, and that's a very polysemous word, but it's a word that Dewey, who I was influenced by, Dewey says a lot about habit, and he's thinking of habit as a way in which you can be inside your own actions. So this is the question with habits, you know, do I form my habits or do my habits form me? He's saying, well, it's both, because you're actually inside them. It's the process in which through your activity, through, as he said, what you undergo, you're continually creating yourself, and of course other people with whom you are involved in relationships of one sort and another. So that habit is a way of talking about how you can be inside the action. I think it's quite interesting how, again, in our everyday speech, habit is relegated to a sort of deposit of leftovers of things that you can't help doing, and you do them without thinking, like me eating my pen all the time. And we're always talking about our bad habits, like the things that are leftovers that somehow we haven't been able to get rid of. But the term is really much richer than that, because habit is really about dress, about care, about how we inhabit a world. And that was Dewey's point. So we're not simply talking about automatic actions, things we do without thinking. We're talking about the way in which we form ourselves and others in and through our own activities in the world. And that's a very active process. It's not a passive one. So that takes us from volition to habit. With agency and agencement, in the sense of agencing, it's basically the same kind of thing. The idea of the agent is that the agent does something. So that with agency, it's as though the agent is the cause and the action is the effect, and they stand in a cause-effect relationship. But with agencing, and this is something I got from reading Erin Manning, who also adopts agencement in this sense of agencing. It's not that I did this. It's that, well, this happened, and then you say, gosh, was that me? So it arises who I am, me, myself, as an agent, is something that arises as a almost post hoc, as a question. Well, who on earth did that? Oh God, was that me? Rather than I did this. There's a sort of assertive sense of self that precedes everything. So that's where the agency comes in. And both of those together, when you put habit and agency together, generate the primacy of attentionality, because both of them are situated in a way in which one is brought into the presence of other beings and things, and attentionality is the way in which those other beings and things are present to you, as distinct from intentionality, which to me, it's an awkward word, but to me, the idea of intentionality still has that ring about it, that it starts in your head. It starts with you. You have an intention which points you in a certain direction to things in the world that are of interest to you. So it's coming from you to the world. Whereas with attentionality, it's kind of the other way around. It's in some ways coming to the world towards you. So then the question will be, if you replace this triad, volition, agency, intentionality, with the triad habit, agencement, attentionality, then what does that do for education? What does it do to our understanding of what it means to lead a life? Because that's the literal translation of education, from ex ducere, to lead a life out into the world. What is it? What is there more to when we say we don't just live our lives but lead them? What is it that makes leading life more than just living it? And that, I mean, that's what I see as the question of education, and clearly one would answer it in a different way if you start from habit, agencement, and attentionality than if you started from the usual triad of volition, agency, and intentionality. And so that was really what the book's about.
And correspondence then comes in this.
Yes, correspondence
about,
comes. Yeah, correspondence comes in as a counterweight to interaction. So that with volition, agency, intentionality, then interaction. Because if you've got an agent, if you've got several agents, and they're all volitional agents, then naturally they interact with one another, going like backwards and forwards, as though between ping pong balls. But if you start with habit, agencement, and attentionality, then those agents cease to be like points. It's no longer points and lines. It's like each one is a particular path of movement, and those paths of movement are then responding to one another as they go along together, and that's correspondence. So that links up as well.
Thank you. And then, well, the theme of correspondence will come back, I think, a little bit later on. As a second, more general topic also for the conversation, we were thinking, the idea of an anthropology of life. We already mentioned a couple of times. And the question of human correspondence. If you allow me to briefly introduce this subject, in the book, well, one of the books, but the one that's that we are using here as a central point of reference, Anthropology and as Education, Llevando la Vida, you say that every life is tasked with bringing other lives into being and with sustaining them for however long it takes for the latter in turn to engender further life. The continuity of life, therefore, is not individual but social, and education in its broadest sense is, according to Dewey, the means of this social continuity of, again, life. And then, as for the urgent call that any anthropology should always be an anthropology of life, meaning that anthropological studies always should be also about life in general, about being alive together, not only for humans. One might say, one might notice in your work a certain kind of tension between, on the one hand, the appeal for a consistently more than human approach proper to such an anthropology of life, and on the other hand, the emphasis on the idea of human correspondence. Let's start from the idea of correspondence, but human correspondence, with the accent on human. In the article published in How, inspired apart from your writings by my studying, accompanying Aymara families studying with Aymara families along their cosmopractical experiences in Bolivia, I tried to show that this more than human raising, more than human attending, more than human caring for, is really about the more than in its full reciprocal dimension. That means also from them to us as humans, no? Rather than just humans corresponding with other humans and with non-humans, seen then mainly, if not exclusively, from the standpoint of the humans. So from the perspective rather of my experience with this indigenous group, the Aymara, or maybe better with these Aymara families and how they get along in their meshworks of life, I would tend to speak in the first place about correspondence in general, maybe similar to Donna Haraway's symbiosis, for instance, and only second about human correspondence. I think I gave the example, from more recent research experiences, how in many Aymara communities, comunidades, the Uywiri, what they call Uywiri, the protecting, educating mountains, they are really considered de facto as judges in the dynamics, in the social dynamics, in the dynamics of ecological and jurisdictional correspondence. In your recent work, and now I'm getting to the point finally, excuse me, in your recent work, however, you are consistent in talking in the first place about human correspondence, as I said, to such an extent that with an Italian dear friend and colleague, Daniele Salvucci, we suggested one could speak about a certain kind of new humanism in your work. No, this question is relevant also for discussing the contemporary theoretical frameworks or perspectives that refer to the speculative, the anthropology of materials, of the imagining of tomorrow in general, the movement of things, and the effective workings of presences beyond human activity. This would be then what we maybe paradoxically might call a non-anthropocentric humanism, or in Rick Pinkston's phrasing, an ecological humanism, and so on. Now he's talking about need humanism. The double question or invitation for you then might be, what about the human in human correspondence, and this suggestion about a new humanism as a third part, first part, excuse me, and second, on the other hand, how can we integrate a more than human approach in our anthropological and educational practices, no? As seen from the perspective of an anthropology of life. I'm sorry,
Okay.
this is a rather complex introduction, but
No, but it's great because you're
please.
absolutely right. I recently, and maybe only in the last year or two, I've found myself wanting to advocate precisely a new humanism, and that's what I think that's what we need, rather than post-humanism. But that's fairly recent, and I think if we just go back a little bit, when I was writing the lecture that became On Human Correspondence, I remember worrying a lot as to whether to call it On Correspondence or whether to call it On Human Correspondence. What to do? Because at that stage I could have called it either one, and I don't think I had a particularly strong view that correspondence had to be human correspondence, not at that time. And the decision to call it On Human Correspondence, so far as I remember, was to some extent a strategic one, that I was giving a lecture to an audience of anthropologists, and I wanted to show what implications this view of correspondence that I was developing would have for classic anthropological themes like the study of kinship or politics or religion. And so it sort of made sense in that context to say, right, this is an anthropological argument. It's addressed to anthropologists. It's dealing with anthropological themes like kinship, religion, and politics. Therefore, sort of strategically, or you might say, for the time being, or for the sake of argument, let's call this, let's stick with humans. It was like that, rather than a principled principle saying this has got to be human. It's more like saying, for the sake of argument and for our present discourse, let's just say that we're dealing with humans for now, without in any way restricting the possibility that correspondence could be extended to living beings of all kinds, or even more than that, wider than that. And it's true that I would still say that the principle, as a principle of things going along together and responding to one another over time, it's not limited to humans at all. You could talk about correspondence in relation to anything that is responding, that is in some sense sensible and sensitive, that has any kind of power of attentiveness and so on, that correspondence is going on. And yet I still find myself wanting to advocate a new humanism, partly in sympathy and partly in response to people like Rick Pinkston. Rick is very concerned to defend humanism against its attacks from various quarters. I mean, humanism is having a difficult time at the moment. It's under attack from the left and from the left accuses humanism as being in bed with colonial oppression and liberal and with or neocolonialism. The right accuses humanists of being woolly liberals, when what we really want is a firm sense of nationality, belonging, and exclusion, and the rest of it. So, exactly. So it's under attack from both sides, and it still seems to me to be very necessary for ourselves and for generations to come. And I mean, our own children and grandchildren who will be human, to find a sense of the future that will allow them, our descendants, to play a positive role in future planetary flourishing. And what worries me about, there are two different varieties of post-humanism, which are the complete opposite of one another. One is the digital artificial intelligence kind of post-humanism, which basically says that humans are rendering themselves extinct. They're producing a form of intelligence that is superior to their own, and often with appeal to theories of natural selection, they say, just as in the evolution of humans, according to Darwin, more intelligent humans always replaced less intelligent ones. So if we produce an intelligence that's greater, more intelligent than we are, then it's going to replace us. And so the post-human future is one in which some kind of superior intelligence has taken over the world. That's one extreme. The other extreme is a humanism which has virtually abdicated any kind of human responsibility and simply said, actually, the planet will get on much better if we without us. So it's a kind of post-humanism where the Anthropocene is actually seen as a world in which humans have through their own attempt to master the planet actually made themselves virtually extinct anyway, and without at least any power to do anything about what goes on. So neither, as an alternative to established humanism, the humanism of the Enlightenment, neither version of post-humanism offers any kind of role for future humans, our descendants, to play a part in the future flourishing of the planet. And I think that we owe it to future generations to come up with something, a vision that would be as hopeful for our descendants as, say, the vision of Enlightenment philosophers in the 18th century was for their descendants. I mean, well, whatever you think about the Enlightenment now, at least 300 years ago, it laid down a vision for how humans could transform their own lives and the planet for the better. And although that vision has now played itself out and is now sort of coming undone under the weight of its own contradictions, we need a vision now which is as powerful and as hopeful today as that vision of the Enlightenment philosophers was back then. That's basically my argument, and I think the way to get at that vision is to go back to this idea, which I took from the philosophy of Ramon Llull in the 13th century, that the human is a humaning animal, that humans are beings that create themselves and one another in the crucible of their common life, and that's a process that carries on. It doesn't have an end to it. It's not moving toward in a progressive way towards some wonderful omega point. It's simply going on, but that we are creating ourselves and one another endlessly in the crucible of our common life. So I want to start from there, and then, and this is the critical thing, I think that actually there is something special about humans. And it's taken me a long time to get to that conclusion, but it simply feels impossible to reach any other. And actually that specialness does come down to things like speech. My argument is this, that rather than rejecting anthropocentrism, we want to have a genuine anthropocentrism. I think that anthropocentrism is a very unfortunate label for what is described by it, because when the West is, or industrialization or anything is criticized, or science is criticized for being anthropocentric, the image is of a pyramid or a pinnacle with humans up on the apex and the rest of the world down there at the base, and humans are in control from this position up above. But what goes along with that is the idea that somehow humans have exteriorized themselves from the world. They're outside it. They're ex-habitants, not inhabitants. And it's crazy, because we're using this word anthropocentrism actually to refer to a position that places humans not in the center of the world, but on the periphery, somewhere on the outside, at the apex, rather than at the center. So I think what we need is an anthropocentrism that actually would put humans in the center of the world, because only if you're right there in the heart of a worlding world can you exercise the proper care and responsibility towards all the other beings that live there, not just human beings, but all the other beings as well. So we want that with the new humanism, we want to have humaning humans there in the middle of things, exercising their responsibilities towards all other beings. And these responsibilities are exceptional in the sense that I don't think that other creatures bear the same responsibility for the flourishing of the species they live with that we have for others. And that's because you could say that every creature lives its life as a story, or every creature is its story. But the thing that I think humans in their humaning do that other creatures don't is to weave their own stories with the stories of other beings into a story for the world. That's what we often call myth. And I don't actually think that other beings, even mountains or animals or whatever, jaguars, whatever, bears, I don't think they do that. So and I think that because we can do that, because we do tell our own stories as part of the story for the world, I think that gives us a very special responsibility for the flourishing of all these other beings that other creatures don't actually have. And there's plenty of evidence. I mean, from your own region, from Amazonia, for example, of how we know from that in pre-colonial times, the activities of cultivators in Amazonia allowed for a hugely richer and more biodiverse environment than would have been the case had they not been there. I mean, their practices of cultivation maintain hundreds of different semi-domesticated plants which were thriving because those people were looking after their environments very carefully. So it's perfectly possible for humans, through the work they do, through their care for the environment, to really create an environment that is flourishing in every respect. Flourishing more than it would happen if the humans weren't there. And if that could happen in the past, then I don't see why, in principle, it couldn't happen in the future. It's just that in the present, we've gone all wrong, and we're destroying everything instead of helping things to flourish. But that doesn't have to be. It's not something inherent in human nature that it has to be like that. So that's what I'm trying to propose now, a new humanism that will be based on a rejuvenation of the past, not on a repudiation of the past, but on the rejuvenation of the past, where humans it wouldn't be tied to a philosophy of progress, but one of sustainability, where the primary task is the one we mentioned earlier in relation to John Dewey, to secure the continuity of social life, and social there not actually being confined to the human.
Yeah, thank you. This is indeed an interesting and important way to, because the other question then was much more practical, no? As anthropologists and educators, we could say.
What do we do?
This concern, how do we do it? No, how sometimes collaborators asked, they asked us, no, how should we, and between brackets, apply? You don't apply it, of course, no. Such a modern human approach, attitude, sensibility, as a human concern, Well, again,
and actually, that practical question is much more difficult to answer. Yes. I mean, it's quite easy to answer these philosophical questions, but the practical one of how we get there. I mean, I would say that education would be a practice of humaning in that respect, and maybe it is something that is peculiar to humans, that the educational project. In some ways, it's not a very important question. Is it peculiar to humans or not? The fact is that we're humans and we have to do it. But how we get from an educational system that is obsessively concerned with progress, with the transmission of knowledge, with the advance of reason, to one, or how we transition, as I put it in another paper, from reason to responsibility, how we begin to think of education as a way of helping people to carry on, everybody to carry on with their lives in a good way. When we've gone so far in the other direction, I don't know how to do it. You can see that there are all sorts of experimental efforts to put this into practice. There are people trying out their experimental schools, their experimental universities, people here and there trying out alternative models, but they're all very small scale. They have no funding or virtually no funding. It's and they're living a kind of hand to mouth life, and it's really hard. And this is a question you bump up to it all the time. People saying, we know how we need to do things differently, but we can't see a path from that, from those little experiments, those little green shoots that are springing up here and there, to one where the whole world would turn around in the way that it needs to do. And many people would just say, well, the only way you can secure that is to bring an end to capitalism. And everybody says that. Nobody seems to know. We thought the virus could do that, but it didn't.
No,
and there was, when it first arrived, we thought maybe the virus will do it, but it didn't. And so I don't think anybody has the answer. It's very easy to speculate about how to do things differently. And lots of people are coming up with ideas about that. But how to get from here to there, I really don't know the answer.
We will be together in that searching. There's another theme with my colleague Felipe Trujillo here with us also, no? We would like to talk briefly with you about, if it's okay for you, we will bring together both questions. The theme of the dimension of time, no? In your work with Henri Bergson, looking at us, if you would like, no? In anthropology and education, time is present constantly, no? Time in communing, as you call it, and communing and differentiating, which would be a first question, I think, or could be a first question. Time as correspondence, or correspondence as time per duration.
Yes,
time as intergenerational, no, ontogenesis, and so on, no? We can remember your article from the 90s already, know the temporality of the landscape, so it's not really a new subject neither, no? So this dimension of time, of perduration, is emerging with ever more strength, I would say, no? So the first little question, could be about this maybe strange, it's not a juxtaposition, but commoning and differentiating, no? In this course of time, of life at the same time, no? You write in the book, Anthropology and as Education, in contexts of education, commoning is above all an achievement of persons of different generations. And also you refer to the things with which a man varies are his genuine environment, and so on. So this would be a first question. How do differences come into being, into life, and what importance should we give them anthropologically? As our standpoint is not so much the different ontologies, no? We're not necessarily cultural relativists, but how is this commoning and differentiating as a first? Maybe you would like to answer this first, and then I would give.
Okay.
We can go on with Felipe.
Because I think the key term perhaps is not difference, but differentiation. So that it's a question of, in other words, it's becoming different, if you like. That one is becoming different from. So if you just imagine the conversation going on between you and I or whoever, and we come into the conversation, we each have our own voices. I can recognize your voice, you can recognize mine. We share some experience, which enables us to carry on a conversation, but we also have very different experiences, different ethnographic experiences for a start. And so we bring different things. We bring our own particular voices, which have been tuned through a lifetime of experience, into a conversation in which we meet and experiences are shared. And then from that conversation, we go each our own separate ways, each of us having taken something from the exchange into the way we carry on, so that actually it's that coming together, that meeting, that exchange. It's through that process of conversation that each person in social life develops their own voice. Right? It's only through conversing with others that any person can develop a voice of their own. And developing a voice of your own is kind of what I mean by differentiation. And the key thing there is that, and this is actually where I differ from Levinas. Although there's much in common, that allowing people into your presence and so on, thinking that for the beings they are, not imposing them a frame on them. You start, but with Levinas, you get this idea that there's me in all my integrity, and you in all yours. You are quite different from me, but somehow from those starting points we can begin to strike up a conversation. So that the what he calls the radical alterity is there a priori. It's then something that we have to try and deal with through conversation. I don't buy that. I would go to the other extreme and say that no, the difference is something that is continually emerging through the togethering that goes on in conversation. It's not something that is given a priori. It's why I don't actually I find this radical alterity a bit awkward. And one context in which this comes out is in the intergenerational relation of parenting. I mean, Levinas doesn't have anything to say about it. The women are curiously absent from Levinas, so they're only men. But he has a chapter in his book on the famous book, but I've forgotten its title now, on the relationship between father and son. And it's very tricky because, in a sense, the son starts off as without a clear sense of self and almost being part of the father. And then somehow or other, this son has to become radically alter to the father, some completely different being. And Levinas has a great difficulty trying to deal with this, as to how a creature that starts off almost entirely merged with its parent, then becomes something which has a complete integrity as distinct from the parent. And in fact, he doesn't really succeed in dealing with it. But to my mind, there are a lot of studies which show about how a sense of self arises developmentally in childhood. So that there is a process of differentiation of the child from its parent, mother or father, whatever, as life goes on. It's the way, if you think about the way in which siblings in a family tend to split apart and develop their own personalities, their own voices. Yeah. That's a process of differentiation, but it happens within a very closely bound social context of a family, and so it's part of the process of correspondence, of people living their lives together.
Thank you, Tim. Felipe,
yeah,
would you like to join us?
Yeah, of course. I have a lot of things that I was thinking while you were speaking, but I'm trying to keep the train of thought we were making with Kun's question. But before I enter into the second question on time, that would be about this idea of longing or to stretching a life, that has also a lot to do with what you were just mentioning, right? As a differentiation for on the one side, and then longing as one of these attributes that we have to make a common life, something that we are looking on the past, but also on the co-construction of a common future. But I would like to go back a little bit on something you mentioned when you were talking about on the why and how post of new humanism. It has to do with the idea of different generations, and on the idea of this phrase of going from reason to responsibility. And this has a lot to do with the idea of longing. And on the second question I have about ethics and ethics as care, that has to do with, I always remember a very powerful discussion here in Latin America and among Latin American political leaders on the role of different countries on pollution and contamination and the construction of a common answer to the environmental issues. And one of the very most notorious tension is on the idea of who are the ones who are going to have to lead with responsibility, and how common is the common ground for doing so. Because I remember, not just in Bolivia, but also in Ecuador and in Uruguay, it's like, yeah, but I mean, political leaders, right? Not like communities, but we need to pollute. Like you are in the Western world, for saying so, you are thinking about solutions, but you already ate the prices. You already used the pollution, and you are kind of constructing a common world when we have to be responsible. But how do you create that common responsibility when apparently we don't have common grounds of how we manage to get to this common world? And it has to do with intergenerationality, I don't know how to say it. And it has to do a lot with how can we start envisioning the planetary? A lot of contemporary anthropological theory is now with the idea of the planetary, of the more than human approaches, but thinking about like the anthropocenic or capital theme or things in a more like planetary way. And a lot of answers from certain parts of the world are, okay, we need to think about the planetary, but how do we equalize it with the local, or how do we equalize it with different historical processes that we have been taking along that make it difficult for us to see this common ground, like and I think that is one of the challenges we have also as when we form or train or accompany new anthropologists, like what is you were talking about that with Kuhn, right? Like with or with whom or when are we gonna inhabit this same place, and how are we gonna help to create the same place for having this common ground? So I would like to ask you for a comment on that first, because then I will have I hope a couple of minutes to take on a more precise question on longing and the ethics of
okay. I think I've got two answers to it. Obviously, it's far too big a question to be able to answer it comprehensively. But firstly, that you can't have responsibility without responsiveness. And one of the problems with attempts to deal with issues such as pollution, toxicity through a state legal framework is that it tries to assign responsibility. Who is responsible for this pollution? Who should bear the costs? Who should be prosecuted, independently of any kind of responsiveness? And that means that the ethics has no kind of moral weight if it's simply defined in terms of a formal legal framework, but is not backed up by actual experience, a felt experience of dealing with these issues. So in a sense, I think the first thing is that we have to recognize that responsibility to be able to respond, to bear responsibility, you have to be able to respond, and that means focusing on the immediate experience of the issues in question. that was the first thing. The other thing is about the relations between generations, because I'm convinced that, and I just wrote my last book. It's called The Rise and Fall of Generation Now, and it basically, in brief, the argument is that we've always been thinking about generations, or in modernity, we've been thinking about generations as layers that replace one another. And that means that the present generation is always standing in between the older generation and the younger generation that's coming along. So they can't collaborate because this present generation is in the middle holding all the cards. But that is historically anomalous throughout most of human history. Generations have been aligned longitudinally, so that in the household, young, middle, and old would all be living and working together, and lives would overlap in the everyday course of things. And I think one of the tragedies of modernity is the way in which the lives of the grandparental generation and grandchildren generation, how those lives have been prized apart, so that they're not communicating on a quite unself-consciously on an everyday basis, and so we have to start thinking about how we can get generations to work together in order to secure that continuity. And that, to me, to these questions of what do we do to secure some sort of planetary flourishing in the future, I think that's absolutely central, that we focus on how we can get generations to work together in doing that.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think that has a lot to do with this idea that Kuhn before mentioned on longing, right? Like, I would like to read a brief quote of your writing on: life is not merely lived in the here and now, but is stretched by a memory of the future that itself allows every present moment to be a new beginning. And for this imagining, remembering, or mnemonic imagining, you introduce the term of longing, the stretching of life. And I think this checks a box of what we're talking, right? Because what we were thinking with Kuhn when we were preparing this conversation is that when we think about the anthropology program in the university, when you train or you go by anthropologists, new generations of anthropology, to use that word also, and you to train them to long for, co-create, participate a new world that is both attending to memory, but also working for a better future, a common future. Yeah. And one of the main challenges that help us like construct this connection between generations is the environmental challenges, like we have discussed. Like that is one of the topics that I think you mentioned very well. And the second topic, for mixing the two questions, is on the ethics of care and longing. Like, I will read another brief quote. Care is the ethical dimension of attention. You have mentioned this before. So as co-responsive beings, as you mentioned, the idea of responsiveness and responsibility, the responsibility of care is something, and I really like this phrase, that falls to us. Yeah, and that is what you mentioned on the work of Levinas, right? And how do we take this idea of the responsibility that falls to us, right? And how do you connect with something that I was thinking about a little word, but it's something that we will translate as civil responsibility of citizenship in a planetary like landscape, because of the idea that it's also heavily like contaminated, I don't know how to say it, in the construction of a common future. That is the idea of freedom, and that you have that phrase, that freedom as a task that a freedom as a task that we owe, not as as something that we can demand and practice, but something that is owed to the common. So if you could refer to that, then I would be very, very happy.
Okay, longing is a really key concept for me, and it implies that remembering and thinking for the future are not opposed but the same. And actually, your comment about the Aymara, that they say that they're facing, you say that they're facing towards the past, they're facing towards their ancestors. That's exactly what I was trying to develop in this generations book. That I was thinking that for at least for many indigenous people, and Aymara is probably one, and I think many other examples, when people say they're following in the footsteps of their ancestors. So I imagined a queue of people lined up. Suppose you have an ice cream kiosk, and everybody's queuing up for their ice cream, and very neatly in a row. And the people who are closest to the kiosk, they came before you did, and they're closer to it. Then there's you, and then there's the people at your back. But you're facing towards the people who got there before. So you could think of every generation like a person in a queue. You could think of generations queuing up like that. So that the ancestors, they went before you. They're further ahead, actually, and they represent, and you are following them, and your descendants are following you. So in following the footsteps of your ancestors, you're remembering them, but at the same time, you're making your way into the future. So that it's actually the same direction. And in modernity, we'd say, oh, you're just going into the past. But for them, they're not going into the past. I mean, following your ancestors is actually the way to your future as well. And for me, it's the idea that actually the way to the future is by following in the footsteps of the people who went before you. That's exactly what longing means. And the power of the concept is that it rolls past and future together in that peculiar way. You can't tell past from future in that ordinary linear chronological sense that mainstream view of time does. And so that for me is essentially what longing is about. And my argument is about how in modernity, it's as though we were in this queue, and then we suddenly turned around to face the people who are coming after us and try to bring this whole procession to a stop. And instead of looking towards the people who went before us, we see the people coming after us heading straight towards us. And that's very much the predicament of modernity. So at some point, we turned our back on our ancestors and said, they're gone, they're the past, they're over, and started heading in the opposite direction. and all the problems kind of started from that. So I'm thinking of longing then as a way which is both a path to a longed for future and a remembrance of people who've gone before you. And that is time in a way. It is the experience of time. And what it does is it means nobody is staking a claim for the present. Nobody is saying we are now. That wherever you are, you're the future's past. You're not standing for this present. So in the book, what I call generation now is precisely, it's not a particular generation. It rather stands for the claim and modernity that generations make to say we own the present, as against both you lot who went before us, you're over the hill, and you lot who are coming after us, you need to be educated so that you know how to do things according to what we have decided. So that's the difference. That answers the first of your questions. I'm not sure whether it answers all of your questions, but anyway,
no,
that's not longing.
Thank you. Kuni?
Yes, no, and also, I'm sorry, am I muted? No. The idea of the weak education, we can come back to a little bit later on, no? It's as a form of longing. Excuse me, what you?
Yeah, okay.
The weak education is going in the same direction in the end, no? something that's done responsibly with others, and so on, no? As a
Mm.
duty.
As a duty. That was the other thing. This
As a form of
it's
care.
really important. The idea that the task is something that you do because it's not something you own, but something you owe. That it falls to you as part of the debt you have to others for your own existence in the world. So you can't say who it actually belongs to. It doesn't belong to you. It doesn't belong to them. It belongs to history. It belongs to life.
That's the falling Felipe mentioned. No? That's why you say that freedom is
yes.
freedom.
And that's why freedom is the task that you owe. And the other sort of image that I had is this posture of care as a way of leaning over. When you care so that you're leaning over the generation that follows. It's an image I took from Bergson. He talks about how each generation leans over.
It's a beautiful image, as a matter of fact.
It's a beautiful image, and so I have this idea that you're following the footsteps of your ancestors, but at the same time you're leaning over backwards over the people who are coming after you, and that would be the posture of a weak education. That's to think from a strong education, where the posture would be confrontational. Here am I, here am I, the teacher. Here are you, the students, and we're banging into one another.
Exactly. Thank you, Tim. Maybe before we move to the last part of at least what we had been talking about before, no, in the interview, the rather new notion, I don't know, of the undercommons, which is maybe not so well known, which we try to translate as infracomunes in Spanish. Starting precisely from what you call the freedom of habit. You discuss in our book, in your book, Anthropology and as Education, Llevando la Vida, how habit, as the attentional way of inhabiting the world, is like the longitudinal, you already mentioned it, longitudinal, to let oneself be guided by the trunk's lines, versus volition, or the intentional, which is the transversal cutting of the same trunk. It will be in the metaphor you use. And then you say, under commons, the minor key is about this longitudinality. And this beautiful, they're not examples, they're not metaphors, they're practices of walking, the free walk. In a free walk, you say, no, the act emerges from within the field of attention as an incipient movement, barely felt at first, matures into a firm sense of direction. This is to acknowledge the generation force of the minor key, the undercommons. How should we understand this, what you call to be, or consider to be a regenerative force, of the undercommons? Maybe very briefly, as a kind of transition to the difficult question of working with indigenous groups and what is supposed to be their undercommons, or
the quick answer is that the undercommons and the minor gesture give room for movement. I mean, in the major, the mantra is joined up thinking. Everything has to be joined up in a rational, like in a machine. Right? All the links have to be tight, so that things move, are connected together and move in a predictable way. What the undercommons does is to shake that up, bring some air into the system, bring a bit of indeterminacy actually into the whole system, and that allows movement. It allows things to move on and allows growth. Because if that wasn't there, if that little bit of indeterminacy wasn't there, then we'd all be stuck. I mean, we'd basically be stuck into the repetitive motions of the machine. And again, that argument owes a lot to Erin Manning when she's talking about the perception of autistic people, that whereas for most of us, almost immediately, when we look at something or a person, we say, I know what that is. No, that's a table, that's a chair, that's Cohen. I mean, we know, and we know, okay, that's who it is or what it is, and we know what to deal with them. And we don't even notice that little moment when we say, what on earth is that? Where things are not quite completely resolved as to what they are. And the thing about autistic perception, according to Manning, is that little moment that for most of us is so brief we hardly notice it, is extended and can be extended indefinitely. So that when you see anything in the environment, well, you're not quite sure what it is. And it kind of could be anything. And it might be this or that. And there's a things are not yet resolved into specific, identifiable, classifiable shapes or forms. And that can lead to uncertainty and disorientation, but can also allow room for growth, for movement, for creation. Because the creation of a world can happen in those spaces of indeterminacy. And if they weren't there, then actually there wouldn't be. The only model of creativity one could possibly have would be one of reassembly of fixed parts, not one of growth and movement and improvisation. So that's where the generative thing. It's an improvisatory kind of generation. Yeah, if that makes sense.
Yes, of course. And I was looking for the name of the second author, Moulton and Hartley.
But it's Moulton and Hartley, Fred Moulton and Stefano Hartley, who came up with the
how
idea.
How they are approaching what is studying, what ought to be a study also, no?
Yes, yeah.
In order to better accompany the people we pretend to study. This will bring me very close to the last subject, which is also what I try to synthesize in the How article about Uywasiña in Aymara cosmopractice, ontogenesis and attentionality. But in fact, it's about what we try to do in the last 5 years, including the pandemic period. It was a little bit difficult. It was this study with a group of people, Aymara people, collaborators, as we say, in a very imperfect way. So the invitation is a little bit to reflect, if you would like to allow me some minutes to introduce the question, the political affective dimension, we called it, but starting from our experiences, our respective experiences of working with so-called indigenous people, Sami in your case, and in mine it would be Andean peoples, and so. Please allow me, I will concentrate a little bit on what I've been preparing here. Many of the things we've been discussing until now, we've been mentioning the anthropological importance of the undercommon perspective, the minor key perspective, about caring and restoring into presence, are immediately relevant for what was the central aim in our research project. Uywasiña means to raise, but also to let oneself be raised. Or Uywasiña, which is the more effective way of saying the same principle. It is a study about the ecological social practices that are generated when Aymara families attend to and correspond with their living environments, and about how they learn to do this, undergoing generation after generation, longitudinally entwined, as well as about what we humans, all of us humans, might learn from their attentional attitudes and practices. No. At the beginning of the text in the article, I stated that the reflection stems from conversations both with my Aymara interlocutors and with theoretical texts, anthropological texts, drawing the wisdom of both into a philosophical anthropological inquiry into the questions of attentionality and ontogenesis. And I mentioned then about that it is a kind of symmetrical approach that would draw no a priori divisions between the studied and the studiers. On the other hand, coming back to the same book that we translated as Llevando la Vida, Anthropology and as Education, you elaborate a critique. That's the political dimension, no? A critique on how traditional knowledge is represented and used. You say that, I quote, the knowledge grows and is grown in correspondence not only of successive generations, but also with animals, plants, and the land. Something that, we could say, is recognized widely nowadays, with an often genuine valorization of these so-called indigenous knowledges, indigenous wisdom, or as we would have it, indigenous cosmopraxis. Inevitably, because of the post-colonial reasons or arguments we know, this will always oblige us to face the problem of scientific appropriation. As you write, traditional knowledge, in short, is an artifact of scientific reason precipitated by science's own claim to have transcended it. We could even say that regardless of the scientific appropriation of traditional knowledge, anthropology as a discipline, a non-disciplinary discipline, but as a discipline, as a form of writing and reporting knowledge, also deepens this tension. Because it draws a line between knowledge, wisdom, that report, and those that are reported. In other words, no matter how much we try to enact a more horizontal, symmetrical way of living and learning with others, anthropology still organizes knowledge from an academic perspective. That distinguishes between capital with the capital, between knowledge with the capital K and knowledges in the plural, no, that are to be studied. So the question is, what if we really expose ourselves to what would be then a real symmetrical approach? Exposing ourselves to what these peoples and groups still practice despite so many conflicts and situations of ongoing exploitation, also scientific exploitation, we might say. That we expose ourselves in order to do what? I put it as a question. To do what in the end, no? So what I tried to do in the article was to say, okay, let's do a radical thing, which of course doesn't really, it didn't succeed, I think, because the scientific article is not the most ideal way of doing it, probably, or the format, no? To put on an equal footing the ideas or concepts from the Aymara people, Beatriz Bautista being one of them, our own anthropological theoretical conceptualizations on the one hand, and on the other hand, what people do on an equal footing, no? What they do and what they practice, paying attention especially to this perspective of the undercommons, and so on, no? Everyday practices that reinforce, that show interesting ways to understand better the more than human. We talked in the beginning of our conversation of this afternoon. Sorry for the long detour. So considering that your own work might be seen in a certain way as a possible guide for the good life, for the better lives. Your work on corresponding, attending, and so on. No? Sometimes it is seen as a rather soft kind of anthropology, weak in the strong sense, we could say, as the weak education. How can and should we care to study with, how can and should we care to study indigenous groups, to study with them, no, without falling in post-colonial academic pitfalls and so on. No? It's an almost impossible question which we struggle with all our careers long.
Yes.
No?
It is an impossible question, and as long as the academy exists as it does now, there's probably no final solution to it. But it is the reason why I've been banging on about anthropology versus ethnography, because I think that presenting the anthropological project as fundamentally a project of ethnography does perpetuate colonial relations, because it takes as its starting point the idea that the anthropologist is going to the field in order to study these people. And that means whatever they actually do in the field, and they might do all sorts of, it might be very with people, but so far as its construction, its academic construction is concerned, regardless of what this person actually does with people in the field, so far as its anthropological, academic construction is concerned, they are there to collect the material from the people and to use that material to produce a body of writing, which is called ethnography, and which will be published and will be shared with audiences that will, although it might go back to the people, will primarily be an audience of fellow academic scholars and students. So that is fundamentally an extractivist colonial model. And the reason I get annoyed with anthropologists who insist upon prioritizing ethnography at the same time as saying that they are opposing colonialism, or that they're pursuing a decolonial agenda, is how hypocritical that is. Because they keep, in the same breath that they talk about decolonizing, they talk about anthropological knowledge production, and they talk about their ethnography and their publications. And as though the whole point about research was it's a one-way transition from the field where you collect your material to the publication. That it begins in the field, it ends in the publication. So if we're going to break with that model, then we have to think of the publication itself as just part of the process. I mean, it's a medium of dissemination, which gets your ideas are out to other people who will hopefully discuss them, but it's completely embedded in this process. But that to my mind, when you ask this question, what's it all for? The answer is so that we can teach. And that's why I think that teaching has to be integral to our understanding of what anthropology is. Not just one of those things that we say, what I really want to do is to write up my ethnography and publish lots of articles. Oh, by the way, I got to teach these wretched students, as though it was some sort of extra thing that you have to do to earn a living. We should recognize that just as we are transformed by our life with the people among whom we're working, then the people, the students, will in turn be transformed, hopefully, by the wisdom that we can convey to them, and by working with them in the lecture room or the seminar room or wherever we are. So there's a conversation that goes on in the field, there's a conversation in the classroom, and there's a rather interesting transition from one to the other. I don't think it's a clean break. It's simply carrying the same conversation on, but some people kind of drop out of it. They're the people who are in the field, and some people join in, and they're the students. And then perhaps it goes back to the field again, and back and forwards and backwards and forwards. But there's a continuous conversation going on, and the key thing is that everybody's being drawn into it. The people you're working with are drawn into it, the students are drawn into it. And that way, the conversation can carry on. Again, it's not a conversation that has an ultimate conclusion, but it is a conversation about how we should live. And that, for me, the name of that conversation is anthropology. So that's why I've been trying to argue that we have to stop conflating anthropology with ethnography, because it does actually reinforce the walls of the academy, separating out those conversations we have within the academy with colleagues and students from conversations we have without it with people in the field. It reinforces those boundaries, and it does so as a mechanism of protecting anthropologists' status and expertise within the rankings of the academy. It's got nothing to do with the anthropological conversation itself. it's part of academic politics, and so that's why I feel so strongly about it.
This drawing into, of course, cannot be an easy challenge, no.
No, of course it's not
because
easy.
it's not only about, it's not about transmitting, but it's about, that's the last question.
I mean, that's the point that
Mm-hmm.
Marceline and others make all the time about what they call weak education or poor pedagogy. That it's not easy. It's full of difficulty, and but that's that's leading life. It's not it's not because it's not all laid down for you. You have to work it out as you go along, and it's difficult.
Yes, because many of those conversations in the field, let's call it like this, no, they're not linguistic. They're not linguistic. They're correspondences. How people correspond with the land they're working, and the effective ways they do it. No, that would be the last I mentioned. No, the affectionate question. What the Aymara in this case, no, well, not case, in my experience, our experience, no, Uywasiña is raising with love, in a Spanish translation with cariño, the little infix C is indicating what is done with care, with love. You are the only anthropologist, I think, that sometimes dares to use, not dare to use, but you're using the word love sometimes, the concept of love, as I've been noticing, which is interesting also, no? So
yes, but I'm actually only drawing that from Hannah Arendt.
Okay, that's true. Yeah.
Who also, and that's her translation of Amor Mundi, which is
Amor Mundi. But you bring it to anthropology, no? So the role the place of emotions, of effects in correspondence dynamics in general, in relation with responsivity, excuse me, receptivity, responsibility. How is it that effects are involved in these correspondence dynamics, as well as in life out there, as in our anthropological educational practices? I mentioned in the preparation for this conversation the concept. Lieve Oreille, whom I've been talking with lately, was reading a book by a sociologist, Hartmut Rose, who was talking about resonance.
Resonance, yes.
Resonant relationships, but with an exclusive focus on individual humans, as individuals, in their relationships, effective relationships, transformative relationships with the world, no? But Lieve, when she's working, we have this ongoing dialogue among each other, but with a central reference always present there, your own work, no? And in her case, it is a search for how your work might inspire in what's so important for her, for Lieve. That's how could we accompany in a good way groups of vulnerable people, no? Where the effective, of course, is a very important dimension, no? It's about corresponding, it's about doing it as all humans do, I think, in an effective way, with an A, no? And sometimes not doing it very well in this sense, no? So this would be a kind of concluding question maybe about the importance and also difficulty, of course, to consider this dimension of not emotions probably, but how we are being affected constantly, and how this is so important, no? In what we try to understand and what we try to then not teach, but to make feel.
It's feeling. I like the word feeling because feeling is something you do. It's better than emotion because emotion is supposed to be something you sort of have inside you and bubbles out. But feeling is you feel something. You're actually in direct haptic contact with the thing that you're feeling, and what we call the feeling emerges out of that. So it's inherently relational. It's not something that is sort of inside coming out, but something that emerges from that relation between the two. And I think, in the context of care, I also was talking with what's her name now? Angela Zhang is an anthropologist from Adelaide in Australia, who's just produced a book based on her PhD studies on fieldwork that she did in an Australian care home with elderly people suffering from all kinds of dementia and this, that, and the other, and so she was doing some hands-on work inside this care home, and one of the things that came out very clearly was the difference between care as it was practiced in the home and care as it was practiced in the family before the old person moved. And the thing about care in the family was that it was quite impossible to distinguish who is doing the caring and who is being cared for. If a young fit person holds an old person by the hand at home, gives them a hand, or crossing the street, they're holding each other's hand, and each is holding the other's hand. Okay, and that's a posture of care. But you can't say who is caring for whom, because they're each caring for each other. You go to the care home, and care becomes a service delivery. So they're the carers who are being paid to do these tasks for the people who are cared for. And one of the things the old people found it very difficult to do was to adjust to this situation in which they're actually categorized as vulnerable people who needed to be cared for, because they felt that they were actually caring for the people who were caring for them. The nurses, the staff working in the care home, they thought, well, we're caring for you if this is a family. But the staff were not supposed to respond to people as though they were being cared for. They were supposed to be doing the caring. So there was this immediate kind of break in people's experience about what care meant. And so I think what we have to do in terms of caring for vulnerable people is to see that actually we're all vulnerable, that care is an expression of our vulnerability, that is relative, maybe, that maybe some people are more vulnerable than others, but we're all but in opening ourselves up to another person, we are intrinsically rendering ourselves vulnerable. And that in that sense, the vulnerability is always reciprocal, and it lies in the care actually inheres in that reciprocity, not in any one side or the other of the relationship.
So as both sides of a coin, if you would. Well, it's
yes,
not
both
original, but vulnerability and care.
Yeah.
The image of the two hands reminded me of brought to my mind the older, you remember Matisse in The Life of Lines, the painting and the
dance. It is that it's kind of like that, and you yourself referred to the reciprocity and the relations between human and more than human earlier on in the discussion. It's kind of the same thing, that if you're caring for the mountains are caring for you, and it's in that reciprocity that the essence of care resides.
Yes, and it's the attentive ways also, the Aymara families as a family, not as an agriculture or as agriculture. They care for their crops and they feel cared by
exactly by them.
No, that's why they offer them a little
crops in the fields care for them too. That's just it.
Dear Tim, I think we are
We're done.
talking for some hour and a half.
Yeah.
Because there was I think it's been a marvelous conversation so
Yeah,
far. So
okay.
the other touching upon art and anthropology would mean to start another kind of conversation, I think.
That'd be for another day, I think.
Yeah,
That would be for
discuss
another
more.
moment. But thank you so much, Felipe. I don't know whether you had some last.
No, just to say thank you for your time and for everything you have shared with us today. So yeah,
Oh, thank you. I've enjoyed it.
yeah,
Okay,
me too.
so we'll
Maybe ask for the Australian colleague. Then maybe you could write it in a message, because I didn't understand so well her name, so we can.
it says it was a Chinese name. I'll just a second.
Okay,
I'll
no,
put
but you can send it later on, or
Yeah.
in a mail or so on. Or we
I
can
can-
ask you some things when.
I just give me a second and I'll Angela said Hang.
It will be interesting for Lieve also.
Ah, cool. Angela.
Zhang. Okay.
Angela Zhang, yeah. So it's a Chinese Australian.
Yeah, I think.
So that's who it was.
Thank you so much, Tim.
She's just got a monograph out with Berg.
Whitberg? Okay.
Yeah.
Let's keep in touch. I don't know.
Okay, yeah. Nice talking to you. Okay.
Have a nice
Well,
thank you so
afternoon
much.
in Aberdeen. Thank you
Yes.
for
I'll
your
say
time.
goodbye
Your
for now.
evening.
Bye bye.
Bye bye.
Take care.